Captain William Bill Thornton stood at the edge of the minefield, watching the sappers work in the pale moonlight of October 23, 1942. Behind him, the entire British Eighth Army was preparing for the massive offensive that would break through German and Italian lines at El Alamein. Ahead lay what the Germans called the Devil's Garden, vast minefields defended by entrenched Axis forces that had stopped Montgomery's army for months. The 3rd Battalion, Royal Sussex Regiment, Thornton's command, had drawn a difficult assignment: advance through a cleared corridor in the minefield, then push 3 miles west into the desert to secure a position that would cut off German supply routes to their forward positions. It was a flanking maneuver, risky and isolated, but if successful, it could collapse the entire Axis defensive line in this sector. "Sir," Lieutenant David Fletcher approached, sand crunching under his boots. "The men are ready. All companies accounted for, approximately 750 men, all equipment loaded, water and ammunition for 3 days. The sappers say our corridor will be clear in 2 hours." Thornton nodded, studying his map under a shielded torch. The plan was straightforward: advance at 0200 hours through the cleared corridor, navigate by compass bearing across 3 miles of open desert, dig in at the objective before dawn, and hold that position while the main British force pressed forward. Simple on paper, but the North African desert had a way of making simple things complicated. "Weather report?" Thornton asked. "Clear skies expected, sir." "No wind, good visibility. Temperature will drop to near freezing tonight, then above 30 Celsius by midday tomorrow. Typical desert conditions." What Thornton didn't mention, what troubled him more than German guns or minefields, was the area they were being sent to. During the briefing, the intelligence officer had casually mentioned that Bedouin guides refused to enter that particular section of desert, claiming it was cursed or haunted. The IO had dismissed it as superstition, but Thornton had spent enough time in North Africa to know that local knowledge was often worth more than British intelligence assessments. At 0200 hours, the 3rd Battalion moved out in single file, following white tape markers laid by the sappers through the minefield. The night was eerily quiet. No artillery, no gunfire, just the crunch of boots on sand and the occasional clink of equipment. The moon was bright enough to see by, casting long shadows that made every rock look like a waiting enemy. "Keep tight formation," Thornton whispered to his company commanders. "If anyone gets off the cleared path, they're dead." Mines everywhere. They passed through the Devil's Garden without incident, emerging on the far side at 0245 hours. Thornton checked his compass, verified the bearing, and led his battalion west into the open desert. Behind them, the main British attack was beginning, the night erupting with artillery fire as 882 guns opened up simultaneously, the largest artillery barrage since World War I. But out here, 3 miles from the main attack, the 3rd Battalion walked in relative silence toward their objective. "Sir?" Sergeant Major Tom Harrison appeared at Thornton's side. "The men are reporting something odd. Their compasses are behaving strangely, needles spinning or pointing in directions that don't match the terrain." Thornton checked his own compass and felt ice in his stomach despite the desert cold. The needle was rotating slowly, as if magnetic north was shifting, refusing to settle on any consistent bearing. He pulled out a backup compass, same behavior. Both instruments were functioning, but whatever they were detecting as north was moving. "Navigate by the stars," Thornton ordered. "We've got clear skies. Use celestial navigation. Keep the battalion moving west." But as they advanced, other problems emerged. Private James Mitchell, a young soldier from Manchester, suddenly called out, "Sir, I can see lights ahead." Multiple lights like a village or camp. Thornton raised his binoculars, scanning the horizon. Mitchell was right. There were lights ahead, perhaps a mile distant. Too many and too organized to be a German patrol. But according to his map, there should be nothing out here. No villages, no installations, just empty desert. "Could be a German position we didn't know about," Fletcher suggested. "Should we engage?" "No, we'll circle north and avoid it. Our orders are to reach our objective, not get into a firefight with every German unit we encounter." The battalion altered course, swinging north to bypass the mysterious lights. But as they moved, something impossible happened. The lights moved too, maintaining the same distance, as if deliberately staying ahead of them. Thornton stopped the battalion and watched through his binoculars as the lights shifted position, moving in ways that vehicles couldn't in this terrain, too smoothly, too quickly. "Sir, this is wrong," Harrison said quietly. "I've been in the desert 2 years. I've never seen anything like this." Thornton agreed but couldn't acknowledge it. He was commanding 750 men who were already nervous about advancing into isolated territory. The last thing he needed was to spread panic about unexplained phenomena. "Resume original course," he ordered. "West, toward our objective. Ignore the lights. They're probably mirage or heat distortion." "Sir, it's near freezing. There's no heat distortion at night." "I know, Sergeant Major, but that's the explanation we're using." "Keep the men moving." As they resumed their march, Private Michael O'Brien, an Irish soldier known for his steady nerves, suddenly stopped walking. "Do you hear that?" he asked his squad mates. "That humming sound?" Others stopped to listen. There was indeed a sound, low, almost below the threshold of hearing, a vibration more felt than heard. It seemed to come from the ground itself, or perhaps from the air, impossible to localize but definitely present. "It's making my teeth ache," one soldier complained. "My fillings feel like they're vibrating," another added. Thornton heard it, too, that strange humming that seemed to resonate in his bones. But they were committed now, almost at their objective. Whatever was causing these phenomena, they had orders to complete their mission. At 0430 hours, the battalion reached its assigned position, a low ridge that offered decent defensive terrain overlooking what should have been German supply routes. Thornton ordered the men to dig in, establishing defensive positions before dawn revealed their location to the enemy. But as his soldiers began digging, they found something that should not have been there. Beneath 6 inches of sand, they struck stone. Not natural rock formations, but carved stone, blocks fitted together with precision, forming what appeared to be a paved surface that extended in every direction. "Sir," Lieutenant Peter Crawford, commanding C Company, called Thornton over to look. "We found ruins of some kind. Ancient ruins by the look of them, but they're not on any maps." Thornton examined the stones by torchlight. Crawford was right. These were worked stones, fitted together in patterns that suggested architecture, not geology. Some had carvings on them, weathered but still visible, symbols that looked vaguely hieroglyphic but in no style. Thornton recognized, from Egyptian monuments he'd seen, the intelligence. "Briefings never mentioned ruins in this area," Fletcher said. "Because British intelligence didn't know they were here," Harrison replied. "But I bet the Bedouin knew. I bet this is why they refused to come to this area." As dawn approached, Thornton's radio operator attempted to establish contact with headquarters to report their successful arrival at the objective, but the radio produced only static, occasionally broken by sounds that might have been voices speaking in no language the operator recognized. Deep, resonant sounds that seemed wrong for human vocal cords. "Sir, I can't raise headquarters. The radio is functioning, but there's massive interference on all frequencies. I'm picking up something, but it's not any signal I've ever heard before." The sun rose over the desert at 6:15 hours, revealing a landscape that made every man in the battalion stop what he was doing and stare. They were not, as they expected, in empty desert overlooking German supply routes. They were in the middle of an ancient city, or what remained of one. Ruins extended for miles in every direction, walls and buildings mostly buried under sand, but clearly visible now in the morning light. The structures followed no architectural pattern familiar to anyone present. The angles were subtly wrong, the proportions strange, the layout seemingly random, yet somehow purposeful. And everywhere were those carved symbols, thousands of them, covering every visible surface. "Where the hell are we?" Fletcher whispered. Thornton had no answer. According to his map and compass bearings, they should be 3 miles west of El Alamein, in open desert, overlooking German positions. But they were clearly somewhere else, somewhere that shouldn't exist, that wasn't on any map, that no British reconnaissance had ever reported. "Sir," Crawford appeared, his face pale. "You need to see what my men found in one of the ruins." Thornton followed him to a partially exposed structure, a building or temple of some kind, its entrance cleared of sand. Inside, carved into the stone walls in multiple languages, including Greek, Latin, and hieroglyphics that any Egyptologist would recognize, was a warning: the place of no return. "Those who enter when the stars are right do not return. The old ones wait beneath. The barrier grows thin. Turn back." The same warning was repeated in each language, carved with such depth that it had survived thousands of years of weathering. And beneath the ancient warnings in much more recent Arabic was another message. 1917, British battalion entered. None returned. 1891, French expedition entered. None returned. Heed the warnings of the ancients. This place belongs to powers beyond human understanding. "Sir, we need to withdraw immediately," Fletcher said, his usual calm demeanor cracking. "This place, whatever it is, it's not where we're supposed to be. We've been brought here somehow, diverted or displaced. We need to get back to our lines." Thornton wanted to agree, wanted to order an immediate withdrawal. But as he looked at his assembled battalion, 750 men watching him, waiting for orders, some clearly frightened by the ruins and warnings, he recognized the reality of their situation. They had marched 3 miles from British lines through a minefield. Attempting to navigate back through that same minefield in daylight, without sappers to guide them, would result in catastrophic casualties. "We hold position until nightfall," Thornton decided. "Then we navigate back to our lines using the cleared corridor. We have food and water for 3 days. We can last 12 hours in defensive positions. But, sir, those warnings are ancient superstition, Lieutenant. We're British soldiers, not children frightened by ghost stories. Post sentries have the men rest in shifts and maintain radio watch. Headquarters will be looking for us when we don't report. Air reconnaissance will spot our position and guide us home." But even as Thornton gave these orders, projecting the confidence his men needed, a part of him knew something was terribly wrong. The compass failures, the moving lights, the humming sound that had now faded but left an echo in his memory, the impossibility of their current position, all of it suggested they were dealing with something beyond normal military operations. Throughout the morning, Thornton's men explored the ruins immediately around their position, documenting what they found. The city, if that's what it was, appeared to predate any known Egyptian civilization. The architecture was wrong in ways that made trained engineers uncomfortable, as if the builders had followed geometric principles that human mathematics couldn't quite capture. Corporal Edward Davies, a schoolteacher before the war who had studied classical history, examined the carvings with growing unease. "Sir, these symbols, some of them match descriptions from obscure ancient texts. Texts that most historians dismiss as mythology, references to civilizations that supposedly existed before Egypt, before Babylon, before anything we recognize as recorded history." "What kind of references?" Thornton asked. "The kind that describe beings who came from the stars, who built cities in impossible places, who possessed knowledge and power that ancient humans worshipped or feared. Sir, there are stories in every culture about places like this. Places where the ancient world intersects with something else, something that existed before us and may still exist in ways we don't understand." At 1100 hours, the radio operator reported success. He'd raised what sounded like a British signal, though the static was still heavy. "Station calling 3rd Battalion, Royal Sussex. This is 3rd Battalion, Royal Sussex, over." The response came through crackling interference. "3 Battalion, your position." "Where?" "Cannot locate." "Search parties." "No trace." "We're at the objective coordinates, approximately 3 miles west of the minefield breach point," the operator replied. "Request confirmation of our position and guidance for return route." The response was broken by static. "No battalion at those." "Searched entire area. No ruins. No structures." "Where are?" The transmission dissolved into interference, then silence. The operator tried repeatedly to re-establish contact, but received only static or those same strange deep sounds that seemed wrong for human speech. "They can't find us," Fletcher said quietly. "We're at the coordinates we were ordered to reach, but British forces searching that area aren't seeing us." "How is that possible?" "It's not possible," Thornton replied. "Unless," he didn't finish the thought. But everyone understood what he was suggesting. Unless they weren't actually in the same physical space as British lines anymore, despite being only 3 miles away by compass bearing. Unless something about this place, about those ruins, about whatever had diverted them here, had displaced them in ways that geography couldn't explain. At 1430 hours, the situation worsened. Sentries on the eastern perimeter, the direction back toward British lines, reported seeing movement. Through binoculars, Thornton observed what appeared to be figures approaching across the desert, but something about them was wrong. They moved in ways that suggested human form but somehow weren't quite right. The proportions slightly off, the gait too smooth, the spacing between them too precise. Could be Germans, Harrison suggested without conviction. Germans don't move like that. And why would Germans be approaching from the direction of our own lines? As the figures drew closer, perhaps 500 yards distant now, details became visible that increased everyone's discomfort. They were tall, impossibly tall, perhaps 8 or 9 feet. They wore what might have been robes or might have been their natural form, impossible to distinguish at this distance. And they moved without creating dust, without disturbing the sand, as if they weren't quite touching the ground. "Stand to," Thornton ordered. "All companies to defensive positions. Prepare to engage if they approach within effective range." 750 rifles, machine guns, and anti-tank weapons trained on the approaching figures. At 300 yards, Thornton raised his binoculars for a better look and immediately wished he hadn't. The figures were not human, had never been human. Their form suggested human shape the way a child's drawing suggests reality, getting the basics right but missing essential details that define actual humanity. Where faces should be were smooth surfaces or perhaps masks or perhaps something else that his mind couldn't quite process. "What are they?" someone whispered. "I don't know," Thornton admitted. "But they're stopping." The figures, he counted 14 of them, had halted at exactly 250 yards, arranging themselves in a pattern that looked geometric, deliberate. They stood motionless, not threatening but clearly blocking the route back toward British lines. For perhaps 5 minutes nothing happened. The figures stood silent and unmoving. The battalion watched, fingers on triggers, waiting for something to break the tension. Then, as if responding to a signal no human could perceive, the figures raised what might have been arms, and the humming sound returned, louder now, more insistent, vibrating through ground and air and the bodies of every man present. "Sir, my nose is bleeding," one soldier reported. Then another, then dozens. Men throughout the battalion developing spontaneous nosebleeds as the humming intensified. "Fall back," Thornton ordered. "Withdraw to the western edge of the ruins. Away from those things." The battalion pulled back in good order, maintaining defensive positions while withdrawing from the figures and their terrible humming. As they retreated, Private Robert Shaw, one of the rear guard, reported seeing the sand around those figures begin to move, not blown by wind, but moving with purpose, flowing upward like water running in reverse, forming patterns around the tall figures that looked like some form of writing or calculation. The battalion established new defensive positions at the far side of the ruin complex, putting half a mile between themselves and those figures. The humming faded somewhat but didn't disappear entirely, and now, as afternoon shadows lengthened, the men began reporting new phenomena. "Sir, the ruins are changing," Corporal Davies reported. "I swear to God they're changing. Buildings that were half buried this morning are more exposed now. Walls that were collapsed are standing. It's like the city is reconstructing itself around us." Thornton saw it too. The ruins that had appeared dead and ancient at dawn were somehow less dead, less ancient. Stone that had been weathered and worn now looked sharper, newer. Carvings that had been barely visible were now clear and distinct. It was as if time itself was running backward in this place, or forward, or in some direction that normal human experience of causality couldn't comprehend. "We're leaving," Thornton decided. "Now. I don't care about minefields or German positions or orders. We're leaving this place immediately." But when companies attempted to move east, back toward British lines, they found their way blocked not by the tall figures but by something worse. The desert itself had changed. Where there had been relatively flat terrain suitable for marching, there was now broken ground filled with those ancient stones, forming barriers that made passage difficult or impossible. And beyond that, a wall of what looked like heat shimmer, though the temperature had dropped with the approaching evening, a distortion in the air that marked what seemed to be a boundary they could not cross. "We're trapped," Fletcher said simply. As darkness fell on October 23, 1942, the 3rd Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment huddled in defensive positions among ruins that were becoming less ruined by the hour, surrounded by a desert that had transformed from merely strange to actively hostile. The tall figures had multiplied. Where there had been 14, there were now dozens, maintaining their positions around the perimeter, silent and waiting. Thornton called his officers together for a council of war. "We have 3 options," he said quietly. First, we attempt to break through the barrier to the east, fighting our way back to British lines regardless of casualties. Second, we hold position and hope that British forces somehow locate us and mount a rescue. Third, we attempt to communicate with those entities and determine what they want. Sir, with respect, we don't negotiate with the enemy. Captain George Blackwood, commanding A Company, protested. Are they the enemy? Thornton asked. They haven't fired on us. They're not Germans or Italians. They're not anything in our field manuals. They're blocking our exit, but they haven't attacked. Maybe they want something. Maybe we can give it to them in exchange for safe passage. Or maybe they're keeping us here until something worse arrives, Harrison suggested darkly. Before they could debate further, Private O'Brien ran up, his face pale even in the darkness. Sir, you need to see this. In the central structure, there's something. Thornton followed him to what appeared to be the largest building in the ruin complex. A temple or palace, perhaps. Its entrance now completely clear of sand, its walls reconstructing themselves with impossible rapidity. Inside, illuminated by torchlight, was a chamber that had definitely not been visible that morning. The chamber was perfectly circular, perhaps 50 feet in diameter, its walls covered with the same strange carvings but now glowing with faint phosphorescence. In the center was a depression in the floor, also circular, perhaps 20 feet across, and from that depression rose a sound, not the humming they'd heard before, but something like breathing, deep and slow, as if something massive was sleeping just below the stone floor. What is this place? Fletcher whispered. Corporal Davies, examining the carvings by torchlight, his hands shaking, read aloud. Chamber of the Sleeper. The gate between worlds. When the stars align, the sleeper wakes, and the boundary fails. Those who are here when the gate opens are claimed, taken below, made part of the eternal city that exists in spaces between spaces. That's impossible, Blackwood said. That's fantasy mythology, is it? Davies gestured around the chamber. We're standing in a city that didn't exist this morning, surrounded by beings that aren't human, trapped by forces we can't explain. Maybe it's time to accept that the mythology was recording something real, something our rational modern minds dismissed because we couldn't categorize it. The stars align, Thornton repeated. What stars? When? Davies consulted his notes. He'd been copying carvings all day, trying to understand them. According to these inscriptions, there's a celestial alignment that occurs roughly every 25 years. The last one was, oh God, 1917. The inscription in Arabic mentioned a British battalion that entered in 1917 and never returned. World War I, Harrison said. The desert campaigns. We lost entire units in the desert, attributed to German action or getting lost in sandstorms. What if some of them ended up here? And the French in 1891? Fletcher added. That's also roughly 25 years before 1917. So this happens every 25 years or so? Thornton asked. And we just happened to be sent here during one of those times? Not by chance, Davies said, his voice hollow. Look at the deployment orders. We were specifically sent to these exact coordinates. Someone knew. Someone wanted British forces here when this happened. The implication was horrifying, that someone in British command, whether through ancient knowledge, enemy infiltration, or some other reason, had deliberately ordered 750 men into a trap that transcended normal military threats. But Thornton couldn't process that now. His immediate priority was survival. We need to leave before whatever is sleeping down there wakes up, he decided. We fight our way through those figures if necessary. Better to die fighting something we can see than wait for something worse. At 2200 hours, Thornton assembled the battalion for a breakout attempt. The plan was simple. Concentrate all firepower on a narrow sector, breach the perimeter of figures, and race east toward British lines regardless of what lay between. They had no other choice. Fix bayonets, Thornton ordered. We go through them or we die trying. Remember your British soldiers. Whatever those things are, they can't have worse weapons than the Germans. On my signal. But before he could give the order to advance, the breathing sound from the central chamber suddenly changed, accelerating, deepening, becoming something that shook the ground beneath their feet. The tall figures around the perimeter raised their arms in unison, and the humming returned with such intensity that men dropped to their knees, hands over their ears, screaming. The depression in the central chamber's floor began to split open like a mouth. revealing darkness beneath that was somehow more than an absence of light, a darkness that seemed to drink in illumination, that suggested depths that geometry couldn't explain. And from that impossible darkness rose something that made the tall figures seem almost benign by comparison. It was vast. How vast was difficult to determine because it seemed to exist in multiple scales simultaneously, parts of it emerging from the opening while other parts seemed already to be everywhere, as if it occupied more dimensions than human senses could fully perceive. Its form suggested something organic but wrong, angles that hurt to look at, surfaces that reflected light in ways that violated optics, appendages or tentacles or something that language had no proper words for, because human experience had never encountered their like. "The sleeper," Davies whispered. "God help us, the sleeper is awake." Men throughout the battalion were screaming now, some firing their weapons uselessly at the emerging entity, others running blindly into the darkness, others simply collapsing where they stood, their minds unable to process what they were witnessing. Discipline that had held through years of desert warfare shattered in seconds when confronted with something that simply should not exist. Thornton himself felt his sanity beginning to crack, felt the urge to run or scream or curl into a ball and surrender to the madness. But he was a British officer, commanding men who depended on him, and if they were going to die in this cursed place, they would die as soldiers. "Fall back to the perimeter," he shouted. "Form defensive square. Keep together. Don't let it separate us." Perhaps 50 men heard him over the chaos and responded to training, forming a defensive square as they'd been taught. The rest, 700 men, were lost in the darkness and terror, scattered across the ruins, fleeing from something that could not be fled, fighting something that could not be fought with rifles and bayonets. The entity that had risen from the chamber was not chasing them. It was simply present, existing in the space they occupied, and that presence was annihilating them in ways that left no bodies, no blood, just absence where men had been. Soldiers would be there one moment, then gone the next, not killed but simply ceased to be, unmade by proximity to something that reality itself could not fully contain. Thornton's defensive square held for perhaps 5 minutes, 50 men, backs to each other, firing at the tall figures that were now advancing, at the entity that was now spreading through the ruins like a darkness that consumed space and time equally. Then the square broke as men simply vanished from within it, reality failing around them, the sleeper's presence dissolving the boundary between existence and whatever lay beyond. Private Michael O'Brien, the Irish soldier who had first heard the humming, was one of the last to go. He stood his ground, firing his rifle until it clicked empty, then drew his bayonet and charged the nearest tall figure in a hopeless act of defiance that would have been magnificent if anyone had survived to remember it. He reached the figure, drove his bayonet into what might have been its chest, and then simply wasn't there anymore. Vanished between one moment and the next, his bayonet falling to the sand, empty of the hand that had held it. Captain Thornton, Sergeant Major Harrison, and 3 privates, the only members of the 3rd Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment who remained, ran for the eastern perimeter, knowing it was hopeless but unable to simply surrender to annihilation. They reached the barrier that had blocked their exit earlier, that wall of distorted air, and found it had changed. It was now more solid, almost visible, and through it they could see the normal desert, could see British positions with their lights and movement, could see the world they'd left behind. "It's right there," one of the privates shouted. "Our lines are right there!" "We can see them, but they can't see us," Harrison said quietly. "We're on the wrong side of reality now. We're in the place the sleeper inhabits, and there's no way back." Behind them, the ruins had fully reconstructed, no longer ancient and weathered, but new, pristine, as if freshly built. The entity from the central chamber had expanded to fill the entire area, its presence making the very air thick and wrong. The tall figures were converging on the last 5 survivors, not moving quickly, but with the inevitable approach of something that had all the time in the world. "I won't be taken alive," Thornton said. "I won't be. Whatever they do to the ones they take, better to die human." He raised his service revolver, but before he could pull the trigger, the barrier before them shimmered and began to thin. Through it, growing clearer, they could see British soldiers, a patrol moving across the desert, approaching their position. "They can see us," a private shouted. "They're coming." But Harrison understood the truth first. No, We're becoming visible to them because we're being pushed out. The sleeper is expelling us from its space. It's had enough British soldiers. It wants fresh ones. As the last 5 survivors of the 3rd Battalion were pushed through the barrier, thrust back into the normal desert like swimmers breaking the surface after diving too deep, they looked back one final time at the place that had consumed 745 of their comrades. The ruins were fading, becoming weathered and ancient again, sinking back beneath the sand. The tall figures were gone. The entity that had risen from below was descending, returning to its sleep. And within seconds, there was nothing there but empty desert. No indication that anything unusual had ever existed in that place. The British patrol found them wandering in shock, babbling about ruins and entities and men who had vanished. They were taken to field hospitals, diagnosed with severe combat fatigue and dehydration, and treated for what doctors assumed was mass hysteria induced by stress and desert conditions. When they insisted that an entire battalion had been lost, that 745 men had vanished in a single night, intelligence officers interviewed them and concluded they had become separated from their unit during the Alamein attack, had wandered in the desert for days, and were suffering from shared delusions. There was no 3rd Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment at Alamein, the intelligence officer informed them. The unit you claim to have served in was never deployed to North Africa. You're confused, suffering from exhaustion. Rest, and you'll remember correctly. But Thornton and the others knew the truth was being deliberately suppressed, that someone in British command knew exactly what had happened, knew about the place they'd been sent, knew that 745 men had been deliberately sacrificed to something that shouldn't exist. The official British records for October 23, 1942 contain no mention of the 3rd Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment at El Alamein. According to military archives, that unit was stationed in England throughout 1942, conducting training exercises, and was not deployed to North Africa until 1943. When questioned about this discrepancy, the Ministry of Defense has consistently stated that survivors of the alleged incident were suffering from combat fatigue, and that no British battalion was lost under mysterious circumstances in the Western Desert. However, certain facts remain difficult to explain. In November 1942, the families of approximately 750 soldiers stationed at various British bases received telegrams informing them that their loved ones had been killed in action or were missing in North Africa. The telegrams were later rescinded with apologies, explained as administrative errors. The men actually stationed in England all along. But the families who received those telegrams have never forgotten, and some have continued to demand explanations that have never been provided. In January 1943, Captain William Thornton, Sergeant Major Thomas Harrison, and 3 other soldiers were quietly discharged from the British Army on medical grounds, diagnosed with severe psychological trauma. They were required to sign the Official Secrets Act with special provisions that threatened prosecution if they ever discussed their service in North Africa. All 5 died within 10 years of the war's end, Thornton in 1948, Harrison in 1952, the others between 1950 and 1953. All deaths were officially attributed to natural causes or accidents, but none of the 5 had lived to age 40. In 1963, a British archaeological team conducting surveys in the Western Desert reported finding unusual ruins approximately 3 miles west of the El Alamein battlefield site, ruins that didn't match any known Egyptian or ancient Mediterranean architecture. The team requested permission to conduct a full excavation, but the request was denied by both Egyptian and British authorities. The site was declared off-limits, and subsequent attempts to locate or photograph those ruins have consistently failed. The coordinates lead to empty desert, as if the ruins appear and disappear according to some cycle beyond human control. In 1977, a researcher examining declassified World War II documents discovered references to Operation Pharaoh's Gate, a classified British intelligence operation in North Africa during 1942. Most details remain redacted, but the available fragments suggest that British authorities had knowledge of anomalous locations in the Western Desert and had conducted controlled testing of these locations using expendable military personnel to determine their nature and potential tactical applications. The researcher who found these documents attempted to publish his findings but died in a car accident before publication. His research materials were confiscated by British security services and have never been released. In 1992, during the 50th anniversary commemorations of El Alamein, an elderly Egyptian man approached British veterans with a story his grandfather had told him, that in October 1942, he had guided British forces through the desert and had warned them not to send troops to certain coordinates, explaining that the Bedouin knew those places were doors that opened at certain times, taking those who entered to places from which there was no return. The British officers had dismissed his warnings as superstition. Days later, the man's grandfather claimed he saw lights in that area of the desert, heard sounds that made no sense, and the next morning found British military equipment scattered across empty sand, with no soldiers anywhere nearby. The western desert of Egypt contains numerous archaeological sites from various periods of history: Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Byzantine. But certain areas remain unexplored and unexplained, places where local guides refuse to go, where equipment malfunctions, where the few who enter report phenomena that science cannot adequately explain. Whether these represent natural geological anomalies, remnants of unknown ancient technologies, or something that fits into no category recognized by modern understanding, they persist as mysteries in a region where human civilization has existed for thousands of years, yet may not represent the first or only intelligence to inhabit those lands. The 3rd Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment officially exists in British military records, but its World War II service record contains no deployment to North Africa. The 745 men who allegedly disappeared overnight at El Alamein exist in no casualty lists, receive no memorial services, rest in no military cemeteries. They simply vanished from history, erased as thoroughly from records as they were from the desert where they spent their final hours. And in the Western Desert, in a place whose exact coordinates shift or perhaps don't exist in consistent geographical terms, ruins that are ancient one day and new the next continue their cycle of appearance and disappearance. Every 25 years or so, when certain celestial alignments occur, the boundary between our reality and whatever lies beneath grows thin. And if anyone is unfortunate enough to be in that place at that time, they join the lost army of El Alamein, soldiers from multiple nations and multiple eras who entered a door they didn't know was there and never found their way back. The desert keeps its secrets, as it always has, as perhaps it always will, and somewhere beneath the sand, in spaces that geometry cannot map and physics cannot explain, the sleeper rests, waiting for the next alignment, the next opening, the next opportunity to remind humanity that the world is larger and stranger than our rational minds can accept, and that some ancient places belong to powers that preceded us and may long outlast us. Powers that occasionally reach up through doors we don't know how to close, claiming those who wander into spaces that were never meant for human habitation. The lost army of El Alamein remains lost, not to German guns or desert storms, but to something far older and more inexplicable, a mystery that military authorities acknowledged privately while denying publicly, a truth buried under classification and deliberate historical erasure. A reminder that even in modern warfare with its technology and rational planning, soldiers can still vanish into the unknown, claimed by forces that our weapons cannot fight and our understanding cannot comprehend.